Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Chicanery. I am your host, Danny, and of course, we have JT.
Hello again.
And so after a brief break, just kind of the way the cookie is crumbling with the schedule so far this year, we are back with another episode. So we are leading off. We have the Japanese Grand Prix, this year's Japanese Grand Prix, um, of which for a race that they moved around to be a little bit easier and a little bit less chaotic than the typical late summer affair, which it is cloudy with a chance of super typhoons. There's still kind of a remarkable amount to kind of shuffle through to get there. I feel like I say that every time, but it almost always ends up being true every time. But I guess without further ado, let's get into it. But first, a word from our sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Home Field has entered the thrilling world of motorsports with the Hendrick Motorsport Collection, which is available to pre-order now. Based out of Indianapolis, you likely already know Home Field for their high-quality, officially licensed collegiate apparel. You probably also know that they have more than 180 schools on their roster, so there's a little something for everyone. I mean, seriously, they even have my local Division II school, Wayne State University. Given Home Field's storied legacy and throwback college apparel and their relentless commitment to quality, moving to racing apparel seemed like the next logical step, and that's reaffirmed in their meticulous approach to designing the Hendrick Motorsport Collection. Iconic logos, legendary drivers, and unforgettable moments, this collection is a celebration of the golden era of NASCAR. Here at Victory Lane Vibes, we're super excited to get our hands on what Home Field has cooked up. Their collegiate wear is second to none. And in concert with some of the most legendary drivers and one of the most legendary teams in NASCAR history, the Hendrick Motorsports Collection is a banger. To learn more, visit www.homefieldapparel.com. Their online storefront is easy and convenient to navigate, making it that much easier for you to proudly represent your favorite drivers and relive NASCAR's glory days. And be sure to use promo code VLV24 for 15% off at checkout on your first order. Again, the Hendrick Motorsport Collection is available to pre-order now. Use promo code VLV24 for 15% off at checkout on your first order. And thanks again to Home Field Apparel for supporting this podcast. And so, yes, like I had mentioned, it has moved in the schedule. Usually the Japanese Grand Prix is a part of the kind of late summer stretch of races in Formula One. But I guess the FIA and Formula One at large were tired of having at least one session red flagged due to weather. Um, certainly if anybody remembers back to about 2017, where there were some concerns that the race wasn't going to happen because there was the mother of all super typhoons moving through that area. But not only that, but additionally, as a part of the Net Zero initiative, I do believe what it's called. Formula One has so many related to reducing carbon emissions, which is good. Let me be clear, but it means that keeping all of them straight is a little difficult. But point being is that yes, the this kind of Asia Pacific, Australia stretch of races were all grouped together this year. Australia, then Japan, and then and I guess as of the time of this recording, about a week and a half from now is the Chinese Grand Prix. Just makes logistics and all of that stuff much easier. But it means that the Japanese Grand Prix was at a place in the calendar where it isn't normally, and well, that's something of a novelty. But there were also some kind of undercurrents of news things kind of going on in the background. So I guess the big thing, at least going into the race weekend, was that, of course, Alpine's woes have been well documented and well memed on by just about everybody, us included. Well, they brought updates to try to fix that. Didn't actually see a whole lot about what the updates were. It looked like front wing and some areas of the floor were a little bit different, but Alpine, or at least I didn't see anything that was super specific about what that was. Maybe we'll get more in future, but that team internally is still kind of in shambles, so that will have something to do with it. But yeah, so the idea is to get themselves out of Q1 and off of the back row of the grid. Um, the how successful they were, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Um, but then one of the big storylines coming from Melbourne was, of course, the whole gigantic kerfuffle with Alex Albon writing off his car in free practice. I think that was FP3. And him basically taking Logan's chassis. Well, they repaired Albon's original chassis from Melbourne. Now, interestingly enough, they wouldn't give Logan back his original car, citing that it would be much too difficult to repair, which I'm like, and like the hard points of the chassis shouldn't really be all that different. Like, you're talking about, suspension setup and, maybe some slight changes in geometry to suit Logan versus Albon, but I'm like, but as, but they, I don't know. It's just in this saga of feeling like they are doing Logan especially dirty. It feels like they found a new dimension with which to kind of dig deeper into, unfortunately. Um, But as a result of all of this and the extraordinary amount of work needed to repair chassis and what have you, the spare chassis won't be ready until Miami. Now, interestingly enough, it was supposed to be ready for China, and this has also been kind of a rolling scale. Um, Originally, the chassis was supposed to be ready for Bahrain, and that didn't happen. Then they're like, oh, it'll definitely be ready for Australia, and of course, that clearly didn't happen, or else we wouldn't be in this particular situation. Um, and then they're like, well, it'll be ready for, China. But then as a result of Albon basically near enough writing off a chassis at Australia, now it's Miami. Who knows? I feel like it's going to be mid-season. There's still Williams still isn't going to have a spare chassis. Um,
Sounds like
but
shades of like IndyCar a little bit, honestly, with their hybrid engine, with like them having to keep pushing back the date when they're supposed to debut it. I mean, initially they were supposed to have it. I think St. Pete was when they were supposed to have the hybrid engine ready, but then it turned out found out like mid off season, like during December, that at least like more than half the teams on the grid hadn't even tested it yet. So it's like, oh, we can't do that. So now I have to push it back to the current date still, I think, which is I think they're still aiming for post Indy 500. And who knows how that's gonna go, but sounds very similar.
yeah, it is. And, you know, so it's one of those tough parts where, don't get me wrong. Let me be perfectly clear. And I think, like a lot of people, the absolutely atrocious way I feel like Williams has handled this definitely has ruined their status of kind of, plucky underdogs for me a little bit. Now it's just like, okay, well, you guys just suck. I was like, it's like it feels kind of like that meme where it's that meme and it's a picture of Lizzo and it's like beautiful, and then it's a picture I think Rick Ross and it's just says it's like you put a shirt on, and that's kind of how it feels for me, to be perfectly honest.
With
Um,
the strong and independent versus the two McDonald's employees where one's like a dude and then it says broke ass and then like it's a lady and then it's like strong and independent.
yeah, I say either one of those work, but it really is how it's kind of felt here for me recently with all of this going on. I don't want to sit here and accuse Williams of sort of technical or administrative or managerial incompetence, because that's not really true. James Vowles talked about it quite extensively in the lead up to I think it was the lead up to Bahrain, actually, and why the car was late and they had basically missed a full day of preseason was overhauling technical structure, and particularly with the way that parts are cataloged and developed and what have you, it really slowed down development of this year's cars, blah, blah, blah. But they felt like it was critical to the team continuing to move forward and upwards. And, I totally understand that. And it was a case of a car, performance upgrades, and a spare chassis, pick two. And they picked the car, obviously. And performance upgrades, although only kind of, actually. Because from what I understand, as a result of some of these issues, some of those performance upgrades are also late. Which is an interesting thing to have managed. I don't know. It's like there's no real time scale on when we're gonna start seeing those. Because same thing, some of those parts were meant to be deployed at Bahrain and Qatar, but it just didn't happen because of just other external factors, and surely the extensive amount of crash damage that the folks in Grove have had to repair recently doesn't help with that. But yeah, but it's such a wonky, funky situation. So hopefully the spare chassis will actually be ready in Miami, because we need to get through China, and I'm not sure that this team can tolerate tearing up another car.
Well, first we need to actually manage to get through a singular race weekend without people tearing shit up before we even get to the actual Grand Prix. I mean, that would solve half their problems, I feel like, if people just, I don't know, didn't tear things up. I mean, sure, accidents happen, and it's like, yeah, it's not like that's like an uncommon thing for drivers to, have little, mistakes, brain fade, whatever you want to call it, lapses in talent, and they end up binning the car during practice or qualifying, and then you know, inevitably set the team back further than they might have been had that not happened. But I'm like, I don't know, sit them down and like scold them like they're your children or something and tell them we can't keep doing this.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there ends up being a conversation like that. Well, children, this is a bit of foreshadowing, but after this particular weekend, because it was, well, in the crash department for Williams, it was not a good one. But it's funny that you say that, though, because, of course, with this budget cap era, it's not like it was before where it was, well, okay, for the bigger teams, it was, binning a car was of little consequences. Like, okay, whatever, we'll just build another one. You know, Granted, for Williams, that's never quite been the case because, I mean, Williams was arguably more cash strapped pre-budget cap era because that was when, may he rest in peace. But that was when, well, frankly, Frank Williams was driving the team into the ground. Um, and so there wasn't really a whole lot of extra money on offer then either. But point being is that in this budget cap era, that's gonna start to hurt like development of again performance components, performance upgrades in season, but also could potentially impact the development of the car, next year's car, if we continue at this pace that we have been. Um, like and I guess the other thing that is probably important, just as a little bit of ground rule, every team has allowances for accident damage. But again, it's gonna be the idea, like you said, is for to stop not wreck the car every weekend. And as a result, it is currently being guesstimated that after the incidents that took place this past weekend at the Japanese Grand Prix, that the crash bill is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a $2 to $3 million currently, which is significant.
AKA a CVS receipt.
Yes, a CVS receipt. Yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah. It's quite, the bill is quite large. We won't know because about the extensiveness of the damage from particularly Albon's crash in the Grand Prix, and again, we'll get to that point a little bit later. But because it happened in the race, the car wasn't able to be released from basically Japanese customs to start heading back to the UK until Sunday evening. Whereas at least at Melbourne, because it was a free practice session, it was pretty easy to get the car out quickly. So we probably won't hear anything about that until the Chinese Grand Prix, which is, like I said, about 10 days away. Nah, yeah, basically 10 days away. Or actually, the first practice session is 10 days away. But yeah, it's just this run of accidents. I mean, it's just truly horrible luck. Because to be fair, Alpine actually was learning. Alpine doesn't have a spare chassis either. Now, granted, they're so slow that you'd be hard pressed to crash the car. But basically, all Williams really needed was just for a few things to fall a little bit differently, and they probably would have been fine.
I mean, Alpine, if they end up binning their car, instead of it being like they actually like full on like crash it, like because they lost it or something, it's gonna be more of like a case of they're a moving chicane on the track and it's somebody else that runs into them instead.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it won't be through a loss of talent because, like I said, I'm pretty sure with the car being as bad as it is, that a trained chimp could probably get the car around any given circuit in about the same amount of time. This car, all grit, but like no anything. It's like the world's most expensive Miata, and being something of a momentum car at the moment. Uh, but at any rate, speaking of slow, there was in the space between the Grand Prix, there's a bit of chatter about bit more chatter about Daniel Ricciardo. He was speaking to the race, I do believe, in a brief piece, and basically in kind of the lead up too. And he's looking into using, basically trying to get a different chassis, basically to see if it's the car, if something's been omitted, or if he is, and this is his words, not mine, mind you, but basically if he's shit. So I,
I think it's the latter, honestly.
yeah, yeah. I know, we've talked about it before. He's a rather popular figure in the paddock, and so I know why folks like him. But yeah, this just feels like McLaren era Daniel Ricciardo, where it was the same thing, where basically Lando was, extracting everything and frankly, and then some out of what were, to be fair, rather capricious McLarens. But then Daniel was just nowhere. It's worth noting that, so far, since Daniel's been back, he has been out qualified by Yuki every single time, bar I think once, and I seem to think that was at Brazil last year, maybe. When that happened, and then he has only finished ahead of Yuki only a couple of times, and that's usually either because some strategy call doesn't go the way of Yuki, or in the case of whatever the hell that team orders was at the very start of this season. But otherwise, Yuki has very much had the measure of Daniel on pace. Just pure, plain and simple. And I understand, part of, being an F1 driver and especially being in any kind of top league is, you got to kind of back yourself almost to the point of delusion. But Daniel calling his current, kind of run of form, I do believe he said it was a bit weird to comprehend. It's like, no, it really isn't. Well, frankly, Daniel Ricciardo is just washed. I mean, again, you and I have beat this horse to death. There was no reason that, especially after Lawson subbed in and he got hurt, there was no reason that Daniel should have been put back in that car, for the rest of the season, let alone been given effectively an extension to run this year. Now, granted, certainly to pick up off of last episode, apparently he's been given a bit of an ultimatum, and that is basically figure your nonsense out or you're sacked. And by all accounts, it looks like Liam Lawson is the kind of the first one in line to take its spot. But yeah, like I said, this just feels like McLaren era Ricciardo, and like it's a shame, but clearly whatever it is, about, especially the current aero regs, he can't quite get to grips with. And basically, any time that there's a car with any kind of slightly odd handling behavior, he's just lost. And again, I think we've talked about it before, but Daniel Ricciardo is not a particularly technical driver. He's kind of, no thoughts, just vibes. Which, when it works, it's brilliant. He's very, very quick, but so much of modern day, particularly modern day Formula One, is understanding the car, and he just doesn't.
I mean, the whole no thoughts, just vibes thing is really only going to get you so far. I mean, not just in Formula One, but I feel like in racing in general, like nowadays, because like again, like the technology has gotten more advanced and stuff like that. Like that's definitely not a strategy that you could pull. Like even, this is not sports cars yet, but even in like if you were racing like hypercars or something or GTP, like that wouldn't really that strategy is really not going to work just because of how like complicated hypercars are. So, I mean, as far as it goes with Daniel Ricciardo, all I'm gonna say is he should probably download Duolingo or something and start learning Chinese.
Yeah. I was gonna use the old Street Fighter quote when you're on Guile's stage, and if you lose, he says, "Go home and be a family man." But yeah, Duolingo works too.
I mean, if this weekend was definitely not promising at all for him, despite the
No,
fact that you had so many people on social media hyping him up, talking about, oh yeah, he usually does good at Suzuka, and like I don't even know. And it's like, well, that didn't happen at all. All those tweets aged like milk on a hot summer day in July.
yeah, I was just about to say, let me go crank out the milk circa 1994. That's about how well this yeah, those tweets aged. I mean, to be fair, I was kind of hopeful too that he might figure it out, because like you said, he's traditionally, if he's been good in any one spot, it has been at Suzuka. But yeah, this weekend didn't go well. But again, that's foreshadowing, children. But speaking of family men, it seems like Vettel might be a little bit bored of being a family man, because there is lots of chatter. There's some unretiring question
It's so
mark.
funny that you mentioned that because I put that in the other the other pod that we're doing for the sports cars segment because you're talking about him being unretired, which I didn't really know anything about him going back to Mercedes or whatever. Like I had no idea that was a thing. I just know like the big deal with him was that he tested a Porsche 963, and then people were speculating on whether or not he would eventually um, join them for a race. Now, I'll just go ahead and get it out of the way since we're already talking about Sebastian Vettel, and it just makes sense to cover it while we're here. Probably not this year, as far as it goes from like at least what I heard today. Porsche hasn't made any plans to like draft him for the 2024 Le Mans entry list, so you probably won't see him in the car this year. So, I mean, at some point, probably. I mean, I don't really know. I know some people are like, "Oh yeah, it's great that uh, he's in the best hypercar in the field," and I'm like, "Okay." And they were using Qatar as the example, and it's like they don't know what BOP is. Bless their heart.
Life is easier when you don't. Uh,
I
but
mean, they'll
yeah,
learn the hard way, unfortunately, like everybody else did anyway. So
uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so no, that was definitely a thing. Yeah, certainly Vettel had tested a 963 recently, which it fueled some speculation that he was going to be up to something. But then yes, then Formula One just really threw fuel on that fire early this past week. Because there was some chatter, that, because Seb seemed to think it was because it's a couple of things, just for a little bit of context. If Seb is making kind of media rounds right now, because I think he's joining basically the race driver make energy drink market, I do believe. I don't know what it's going to be called, but that's going to be a thing. And so there were some media rounds as a kind of a direct result of that, and people were talking about unretiring. Because to be fair, Seb, when he retired from Formula One, he kind of did a Mika Hakkinen, kind of in that he was retiring, but still trying to leave the door open um, to come back should he want to. Um, and this is kind of, I guess, the first salvo in that discussion because he talked about he would come back certainly if everything worked out, if the stars kind of all aligned. I can't remember exactly what language, what verbiage he used, but basically, if it all kind of works, and he would do it because, I mean, we've talked about it a lot. The F1 calendar is getting increasingly rigorous and, blah, blah, yada, yada. And then, there was some talk, Lewis kind of hanging off of the end of that being, well, Seb would be a fun option for, the 2025 seat should they feel like Antonelli isn't good enough, isn't ready. He thinks Seb would be a great option. And then Seb and Toto have both said in sort of separate press events that they have been in communication. And I find that curious. In the case of Lewis, is kind of hyping up his buddy, and which, good on him. Everybody needs a friend like Lewis. But it's like, Seb hasn't been in the car, like, he hasn't driven anything at all in 2 years. So, I mean, he's driven these current cars, so, I mean, he certainly knows what to expect, but, I can't imagine him being that high on anybody's list in Mercedes as somebody to pick. I mean, stranger things have happened, sure, but you know, I don't know. It feels like a long shot. I don't know if, maybe Seb is drumming up a little bit of noise for his stuff and Toto as well, frankly, being Toto. So I don't really know quite what to make of any of this. Other than Seb is a wonderful human being and having him back on the grid would make it more tolerable, frankly. But
I feel
that
like
is
he might end up just going the same route Jensen Button went.
yeah, that's distinctly possible because Jensen did a few sub-ins, and then, Jensen's been up to all kinds of stuff in these last handful of years.
I don't know. Race car drivers are just so interesting to me. The ones that just like, I feel like they like some of them are like, okay, they retire and they legitimately retire. And then some of them I'm like, I feel like they retire, but then I feel like at the same time they don't actually want to retire. Or like, I don't know. For whatever, I honestly feel like more race car drivers when they die need to like donate their brains to science because I feel like just like their brains are just like wired differently somehow. Because I'm like, I don't know. I feel like just because like I don't know, racing cars just so like rigorous and like you go and stop doing that after doing that for pretty much like between the time that you're like a freaking like 5 years old and you can actually like race cars up until like you being like mid 30s and 40s. It's like that's a long time to do all that kind of stuff. And I feel like sometimes it's like there's nothing when they just retire, they still need something to like I guess scratch that itch in their brain. And that's why a lot of them just like, oh yeah, I'm retiring. And then like 2 or 3 years later, they're like, well, actually, I might have lied and I'm not actually retiring and I need to do something else. I mean, it's part of my theory of why like so many race car drivers like doing snow activities. As dangerous as it is, and the amount of times that you've seen a lot of drivers do it and they end up not coming back from those little trips, ski trips with all their bones intact, but it is what it is. They still do it anyways, and teams don't really seem to care. So I just think it's like they always like need something that's like constantly stimulating. So then like retiring is just very difficult for them.
Yeah, and I definitely think you're on to something. The ironic bit is that the only guy who never really formally retired, Mika Hakkinen, like I alluded to earlier, he kind of left the door open, arguably out of all of the drivers in the last, 20 years. Actually, it's been a little bit longer than that for Mika now. Time flies when you're getting old. Um, is And he's the one that has arguably kind of done the least. He seems to be the one who has been most content to kind of chill, which I find just really, really funny because he made it very clear that when he left McLaren, and I guess it would have been 02, 03, whenever that was. I'm not retiring. This is just a break. And it's like, nah, dog. I'm pretty sure you've retired. But the rest of
And
them,
they all
yeah.
have like full blown families and like children. I'm like, well, you don't want to spend more time with your kids or none. Like by the time like you're talking about, oh, I'm gonna retire, but then I'm actually not. And then by the time like you be going in and out of racing, and you're spending so much time again going in and out of racing to the point where your kids that are like 2 years old now are gonna be fucking like 18 and going off to college, and you're gonna be like, well, what happened? It's like because you spent like no fucking time with them. That's why.
Yeah,
No shade or
exactly.
anything, but I'm like, I just like, what did you start a family for? Like, honestly, in my opinion, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't bother trying to settle down and get married and worry about like partners and stuff like that. I would just live my life and do me and not worry about kids, significant others, and just do what I want to do.
Yeah, honestly, I completely agree with all of that because, yeah, you're absolutely right. By the time they're done filling up their schedule with all these one-off events, it's basically a full race calendar anyway, more or less at that point. And yeah, and it does kind of defeat the purpose of retiring. Yeah, I don't know. That's something absolutely I would, if there's some, high power university out there, their med school should really like study that, look into that, because I'd be really curious to understand certainly quite how that works in a race driver's brain, quite how they justify that. But yes, that is a very different podcast for a very different day. Yeah, so moving into the weekend. So it's funny. I mentioned part of why the race weekend was moved was to some extent mitigate rain chances. Well, that is another thing, like aged like milk. It was very cold and gray in FP1. Um, although no rain, but FP2 was basically a washout.
Do they have the NASCAR bug now where the bad weather's just gonna follow them everywhere no matter where they go?
It would be very funny if it did. Um, but yeah, in FP2, there were out of the 20 cars, there were only 13 laps that were like timed. And out of those, none of them were representative of car/track pace, because basically everybody was kind of crawling around. The folks who did run were crawling around on inters. And yeah, like I said, it just wasn't really representative of what the times that we would end up seeing in particularly FP3, where the circuit was arguably at its quickest. But to back that up just a little bit and kind of get into FP1. So yeah, we mentioned Williams and their torrid string of luck. During FP1, actually pretty early in, Logan dipped a wheel into the grass at the Dunlop Curve and crashed it quite heavily. Thankfully, it was limited to front wing suspension, and actually, from what I understand, the gearbox took kind of a nasty jolt and all of that. So nothing insurmountable, nothing that couldn't be fixed on site, which is good. But it's, when you already know that Williams doesn't have a spare chassis, it's one of those things you look at it and you kind of go, ooh, that's not great. Uh, and well, it wasn't. Um,
It's getting real hard to defend Logan Sargeant. I'm just gonna be honest. I mean, like again, I'm not really a fan of him, but like I just like I'm inclined to like I don't know defend drivers and whatnot if like I don't know I don't have to like them or anything unless they're like a completely terrible person. Like I'll usually try and like defend them if I'm like yeah I don't think this is right or feel like they were wronged or something like that. Just like stuff like that. Because sometimes I'm like, you know what, if they were wrong, they were wronged. I don't like particularly seeing people get wronged. I think that's, I don't like it. But I'm like, it's getting a little difficult to defend him because I'm like, bro, come on.
yeah,
And then you have people on Twitter being like, saying, at least one person I saw being like, it wasn't his fault. And it's like, it was his fault because he had understeer and actually had a lot of time when you look back at it to correct his mistake and still didn't, and ended up bending the car into the wall.
Yeah, I was actually just about to say that. Yeah, I know they were, trying to, point to, oh, well, the chassis is, was irreparably damaged, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, first of all, when they fix those things is that, they do have to effectively, they basically, they don't, if I remember correctly, they don't have to crash test it, but the FIA, they do have some stipulations for safety about like, they put them basically on these like load jigs, and they put like all of these little individual load cells around them to make sure that they're fine. Um, and it's like, well, the car passed, so it's fine. And, they were trying to point to, oh, well, the setup's all wonky. It's like, no, when you're doing something like understeering off the track into the grass, the just wheel setup and alignment. So, camber and toe are always dynamic. They're always moving and shifting based on loads in the tires, blah, blah, yada, yada. You're listening to a motorsports podcast. I probably don't need to explain that to you, so I'm going to keep it brief. But these things are dynamic. Camber is dynamic, toe is dynamic, so on and so forth, and especially suspension loading. These things change. So it's like, the combination of understeer and then being onto the grass. Yes, the alignment's going to look all kinds of weird because the car is doing something that fundamentally it was not really intended to do. But no, that was absolutely Logan's bad. I still think he got screwed over in Melbourne, but, it does give certainly this very clumsy, very, in my opinion, very avoidable accident certainly gives his detractors a lot of ammo for
I
why
mean,
that
at
was.
the end of the day, both points can be true. He got screwed over at the Australian Grand Prix, and this was also this practice, like this crash and free practice was his fault.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good summation. But yeah, so that was not great. But something that was kind of neat is Ayumu Iwasa, Super Formula driver and actually a Formula 2 race winner, made his F1 debut in free practice, FP1. He basically told Daniel to get out of his car and took the spot, and he would end up P15 in the session, just behind Stroll and Bottas. So, as far as F1 debuts go, pretty low key. I don't know if this is a sign of things to come, maybe. Given that he's a complete unknown, as much as Ricciardo is absolutely washed, I wouldn't put Iwasa in this seat either. But I don't know. Maybe big sponsorship? Yeah, I don't know. And truth be told, it could have just been a fun PR thing for the Japanese Grand Prix, since this was basically a home soil event. And then to have, two Japanese drivers basically out on track together in Formula One, which hasn't happened since the early days of Super Aguri, which it would have been Kamui and Yuji Ide, I think, is the last time that there were two Japanese drivers on track together and at the same time in F1. Huh. I'll need to fact check that, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. But yeah, that was, truth be told, about the extent of the excitement in free practice. Like I said, FP2 was effectively a washout. Times were slow and no one was really doing a whole lot of anything. And then FP3, there were a couple of spins early as drivers were trying to find grip on a green and kind of cold circuit. But pretty much once everybody got up to speed, kind of that was that. But moving on to quali. You know how I talked about the Alpine bringing those upgrades to Japan? Yeah, it didn't work. Now in fairness, Ocon lifted. He drugged the car to Q2, but best he could manage was P15, and Gasly qualified P17. So upgrades for it to.
I'll give them credit. They made some progress. Okay, not both cars. I mean, it's better than both cars not making it past Q3. at least one car made it out of Q3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah. To be fair, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, dragging one car to Q2 was helpful. Um, but yeah, it's just, I mean, the car is still slow. Um, yeah, yeah. There was a minor during Q1. Actually, it was towards the end of Q1. There was a minor incident with Russell and Piastri, unsafe release. There was no further action taken, but it made Oscar very upset, which is kind of funny.
Like
Um,
that's very rare. Like I don't
mhm.
know. I'm like imagining what Oscar Piastri looks and sounds like being upset, and I'm just like, I don't know what to imagine. Like I don't really know what the
Yeah,
picture.
it's funny. If anything, it's more adorable than anything. It's kind of like when a very small child gets kind of grumpy, but they're still trying to behave themselves. That's kind of what the radio message was like. Um, but yeah, but he was definitely kind of annoyed by that. Um, you know, Yuki Tsunoda continued his qualifying form and knocking. Well, I say knocking big dogs, keeping them out of the final qualifying session. It was Lewis that he denied a Q3 berth in Melbourne. This time it was Daniel Ricciardo, who, to be fair, actually did have a reasonable qualifying session. So he would end up qualifying P11. Sonoda would place on the grid P10, which, given that the fact that uh, Racing Bulls, I still struggle with that name because I very nearly said AlphaTauri again for the second consecutive show. Um, But yeah, it's a real uplift from sort of where they have been, because those first couple races of the season were a little shaky, but they figured it out. Um, but who didn't figure it out was, well, yet again, Mercedes. So, I talked a little bit about the circuit being kind of at its fastest in FP3, and the Mercs were loving it. It was P3, P4, George Lewis at the end of FP3, but that would only translate to P7, P9 Hamilton Russell in qualifying, which is, well, as I'm sure you'll see, is a marked drop off. Um, now granted, track temps were significantly higher, and that seemed to be the cause of Mercedes' woes broadly over the weekend. But also, this car is just garbage. But at any rate, it was business as usual. A Red Bull front row lockout, which actually, to be fair, in itself is quite rare because usually Charles or Carlos pip Perez for P2 on the grid. But Perez pulled it together and was only 7 thousandths behind Verstappen. It was actually 66 10 thousandths, but I like rounding, so 7 thousandths it is. Which is good. And, well, frankly, given that these last couple Red Bulls have been rocket ships, we really should have more of that. Um, but moving on to race day, like I said, I mentioned it a little bit before, but yeah, track temps were much higher on race day than was expected. I think at one point track temps, I think at the start of the Grand Prix, track temps were like 36 degrees centigrade, which is very, very warm, all things considered. But at any rate, so we'll jump right into it. This was kind of the big thing of the race. It was lap 1, turn 3. Massive accident with Daniel Ricciardo and Alex Albon, which led to about a half-hour red flag period, which is very irritating when the race starts at 1 a.m. But that's a different thing altogether. Um, But yeah, it was just such a dumb accident. To be fair, as much as I'm enjoying Flaming Williams, this was not Alex's fault at all. He was around the outside, had enough space, but Danny got spooked by somebody. I think it was Alonso. It was definitely one of the Aston Martins. I just don't remember who. Um, it's funny, and the broadcast had the gall to blame Yuki as if Yuki wasn't like 3 rows up the grid. But at any rate, um, But yeah, it's like I said, I'm pretty sure it was Alonso that was up the inside of Ricardo, and it spooked Danny, and he just drifted up the outside and completely boxed out Albon, which is, like I said, that's just such a dumb crash. And like I understand that certainly the drivers can't look everywhere at once all the time, but that is just such a fundamental lack of situational awareness that
It
like
looked
it is
like
actually.
Ricardo didn't use his mirrors like at all.
No, he
It's
didn't.
like you do realize the mirrors on the side of the car are not just
They're not
decorative
decorative.
and ornamental, like they're actual mirrors that you like look in and use to see if somebody's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't get it, because like I said, he looks over when he sees Alonso and goes, yeah. And then I understand wanting to give a little bit of room because, Suzuka is a little bit narrow in those first few sections. Pardon me. Yeah, I totally understand that. Yeah. And like I said, how do you not pay attention? And Alex was basically alongside him at that point, too. It's like, so, okay, fine. Even if you're not using the mirrors, how do you not see this gigantic blue Williams basically next to you? And I don't know. I don't, like I said, I don't know. I don't get it.
Again, he needs to go to the app store, download Duolingo. I'm so serious.
Yeah, it's just, like I said, it's so bad. And like I said, we talked about it earlier, but this is the exact kind of incident that Williams absolutely did not need, because it is another crash that has required for that chassis to be sent back to Grove to basically be looked at and fixed. And also a bit of that story that I failed to mention earlier, but when having to fix the first chassis, is that apparently that was a bank holiday in the UK, and that the folks at the factory weren't terribly happy about being called into work. And for that, I feel bad, and I'm very sorry for all of them.
I
Um,
really wish I could have been like a fly on the wall in the Williams garage this weekend when their other car got, demolished.
yeah,
It's like I want to know how many mechanics were probably just like either swearing under their breath. They're probably, just straight up swearing out loud.
I was just about to say it couldn't have been under their breath at this point. But yeah, it's just ugh. My heart bleeds for the like I said, the folks, both the folks in garage at these events and the folks back in the UK constantly having to fix cars, because I'm sure they're getting very sick of that. But yeah, like I said, it's just such a dumb accident to have. And and to be fair, you could see it in the broadcast. Danny, he checked on Albon, and he was very obvious. You could see it in his body language. He was very apologetic, which, I mean, that's nice. Um, but yeah, it's like, I don't know, maybe you should have done that, F1 show with Will Arnett that was being produced before you decided to take the F1 drive. Um, well, truth be told, he might still get an opportunity to do it based on how this is going. Because if those rumors are to be,
We can just go and produce merch. I think we can just go and do that.
yeah, honestly,
I mean,
probably
that's
not.
a lot easier than learning Chinese, I will say. As somebody who has family members who are Chinese and speak Chinese and stuff like that, it's a very complicated language. So
Yes.
you probably have a better chance just selling merch, or, I don't know, making a podcast or something. Well, I don't know. I don't really know if we need the competition, but whatever.
But yeah, but as a result of all that, lengthy red flag, standing start yet again. And basically they, re-racked the start more or less, because of course the F1's very stupid red flag procedure is that you can service the cars, which is like, well, that's kind of stupid. But point is everybody that started on softs basically went, okay, actually this is stupid, and switched on hards. Everybody except for the Astons were the only ones that didn't.
I actually
Um,
forgot about that procedure because I think like the day that everybody learned, I feel it was funny because I'm pretty sure like the day there was like one collective F1 race that everybody and like from other motorsports disciplines watched it and all collectively at the same time learned that F1 has that rule that you are allowed to service the car under red flag, and like everybody collectively agreed that it was stupid. I
Yeah,
feel like it was during Abu Dhabi because I feel like that was like one of the few times that like the whole motorsports world was watching an F1 race.
so I know what race you're talking about. It wasn't. It was Monza 2020 because that would have been Lewis's 100th career victory had he won that race. And so that's why everybody was watching, was to see basically to see that record set. And then there was a gigantic crash somewhere. I don't remember where. For some reason, I feel like it was in Parabolica because I feel like it was a really dumb place to have an accident. But regardless, it was enough to red flag proceedings. And then, yes, that rule is basically what screwed him.
I just saw a
And also,
barrage of tweets from like fans and like drivers from other series being like, "This is stupid as fuck." And I'm like, okay, I guess we all learned that this is what
yeah,
F1 does.
yeah, exactly. It was indeed really, really dumb. But yeah, so because of that, yeah, a lot of folks switched over to the hards. Now, so I say that Mercedes would actually attempt to one stop because Suzuka is kind of a. I feel like I say this. I feel like we say this a lot about F1 circuits, but Suzuka is a high deg circuit, and so running on 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 hards or trying to run like softer tires, it just doesn't work. And it was particularly bad today because of the high track temps. And it yeah, so the idea was to try to one stop, which is kind of tough at the best of times. And it just didn't work because they ended up stopping for another set of hards because Mercedes was really committed to the strategy. And then finally Lewis was like, okay, this is stupid. And they ended up both pitting for mediums like 15 laps before the end or so. It'd be interesting. I'd have to sit down and do the math to see how if stopping and pitting for mediums costs them more time than trying to stay out on the circuit and struggle. Probably did because they were running like P5 and P6, I do believe. After particularly that first set of stops after the red flag, because again, red flag procedure is weird and dumb. But yeah, I don't know how much time that cost, but yeah, but it didn't work, I guess is my point. Um, but Sauber is continuing kind of their full run of crummy luck because Zhou Guanyu would retire at like lap 13 with some unspecified technical issue. He just came in for the pits randomly about 4 laps after pitting the first time, and then they were wheeling the car to the garage, and it's just like, oh, well, okay then. And at least as of the time of this recording, I did not see anything, any reason why he retired. So who knows? And it was actually around that time when Stroll and Alonso would swap the softs for a set of mediums. And it was again another unsafe release because Stroll was released and he was basically running in the slow lane alongside a Haas. I think it was Hulkenberg. I don't remember, but yeah, he was just there and using the slow lane. Well, I don't know if there's any provision that says that you can't do that in such a scenario. But Stroll, he did it, and to be fair, I don't remember there. Well, actually, there wasn't a penalty related, so it was just enough to irk the stewards a bit, and they moved on. But it is what it is, I guess. But anyway, moving into kind of the closing stages of the race. With about 10 to go, Sargeant had an almighty lockup for reasons unclear to anybody, including possibly Logan. It was into Degner too, and brought out yellows for a bit while he got himself oriented correctly. I mean, well out of the points, well down the order, so it wasn't really a whole lot at stake here, but just kind of a fitting into what had been a pretty miserable weekend. Um, Russell would go on the hunt and bag P7 from Piastri, which again, another instance of Piastri being a bit annoyed because while this was all going on, Piastri felt like he had been sort of pushed off of the circuit at the chicane. which again, stewards looked into it and decided it was fine. And of course, the inevitable happened. It was a Red Bull 1-2 for Verstappen, Perez. Sainz would round out podium, and hometown hero Sonoda would scoop up a point. He made a few aggressive overtakes on the Haas's and Albon, and got himself into a points-paying place and did it, got it, and that about rounds out the Grand Prix. Thankfully, at the time of this writing, there really isn't a whole lot particularly interesting in the news cycle happening. So perhaps we can actually close out an episode, an F1 recap normally for a change. But yeah, that about sums it up. So I guess with that, that has been an episode, entirely F1 centric episode, no less, which doesn't happen super often. Of Chicanery. We are your hosts. I am Danny and JT, and thank you so much for listening. Until next time, y'all.